Hi, my name is Dave Reske, CEO of Now Speed Marketing, and welcome to this edition of Marketing in the Now, where we talk about the best ideas in digital marketing. And my guest today is Jen Anderson. Jen is a fractional CMO at an agency that she co-owns called Contento. Jen, welcome to the show.
For having me.
Jen, we've been talking about how to create holistic B2B go-to-market strategies. And this is something that you've done over and over again with your clients and with companies that you worked for. And I just want to start by asking you, in general, what are the keys to really creating a really good strategy, a go-to-market strategy?
I think it largely depends on the company maturity. So let's take a startup, for example. A startup, typically most startups, they are going into market before they've done any research on their market. I see a lot of CEOs who have what they think are really strong um, product market fit for their products, and they just don't. And they don't discover that until it's too late. And so what I would really recommend for especially small businesses that are still in growth stage is for them to do qualitative interviews with their target audience. First of all, defining your ICP, your ideal customer profile. You have your total addressable market, which is the whole universe of potential people who can buy from you, right? But then you have your ideal customer profile, the customers that you're designing your product for, because they're the bread and butter of your business. And some companies have multiple ICPs, and that's fine. But defining that and then going and talking to those people at scale is where a lot of companies they skip the research and the strategy phase. And so I highly recommend starting with qualitative interviews, asking the questions about what's on their mind, what is top of mind, what are they stressed about, getting into the emotional side of their psychology, not just the demographics or the psychographics or firmographics or even just functional needs, but getting into like their psychological needs, right? Help having that understanding and then designing a quant survey based on that information will help you really scale what you think you know versus what you actually know, and what you still need to find out. So that's what I typically tell companies to start with.
Yeah, I love the way that you started with the startup phase. We'll talk about the other phases of growth too. But what I heard you say is really make sure you've got product market fit and really focus on the ICP that you're going after. And it feels like many, especially in tech, there's this almost this tendency to say, "Oh, we know better than all of them. We know what the market really wants. We don't really have to worry about the product market fit because we're going to make sure we're going to create this product that's so amazing that everybody's going to want it." So, how do you overcome that reluctance of especially B2B uh, companies to do that original research to figure that out when they kind of feel like they know it?
Yeah, it's a
Oh,
tough one,
yeah,
right? Because consumer marketers and consumer companies already do this because it's just
absolutely.
part of their process of
Yeah.
practice. Where I think there's a challenge in B2B is there aren't a lot of, I don't know, it's been 20 years since I've been in business school, but when I was going to school, we didn't talk about a differentiator between how consumer businesses go to market versus B2B, right? We just talked about it all in the context of consumer. And then when you graduate and you enter the workforce and you go into B2B companies like I did, it's confusing because the process is different. And what you learned in school is very different, and how you actually apply it is very different. And so, to a certain extent, I think that a lot of B2B companies are relying on their investors to direct them on what best practices. And investors are, I think, becoming significantly more risk adverse. And so they're going to promote a standardized sort of go to market playbook for B2B businesses instead of encouraging founders or small company owners or even mid-market company owners to really think about it, does this playbook make sense for me and my ICP? Because everything is meant, every framework that exists should be adapted for your specific use case as opposed to just implemented as a you know a defined process or framework that you should just use out of the box, right? And when you do that, when you apply it in that way, you inherently take risk out of the equation and you do what is safe, and safe doesn't lead markets, safe follows. So if
Mm,
you want to lead markets, you have to do something that's risky.
mm.
And you have to think about things differently than you maybe even your investors are encouraging you to think about.
And so that primary research that you're recommending, it really leads you to those insights that are going to help you develop breakthrough ideas. They're going to help you develop competitive advantage that'll help you understand what your ICP is, what your the best fit for your product in the market. So it's really core to doing all of that.
Yep.
So I want to understand like your process of doing the research. Where do you get that data, and how do you efficiently produce the research or do the research to find out the answers that you're looking for?
I think that if you have no resource and you're trying to implement this yourself in a very sort of bare bones kind of manner, I would encourage founders to go out and look at their networks and find and schedule interviews with 10 to 15 people in their ICP as a starting point. Once you get to interview number 5 or so, you're going to start to see trends and patterns that you're hearing from these people, which enables you to ask more detailed follow-up questions,
Mm,
right? And the point of the qual is really just to inform what you include on the quant survey. A lot of people start with quant and they're not asking the right questions to get the insights that they need to be competitive. So what I always suggest with my clients, or even if I'm working internally in a company, is to start with the qualitative interviews, use that to guide what we think we know versus what we actually know, uncover the gaps that we need to address, and then use the quantitative survey to scale it to a sample size that's statistically significant for our specific market. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean by insights that are actually actionable for a marketer. A lot of B2B companies, especially in tech, focus on their product functionality. What does the product solve? And how does it solve it, right? But they're missing a function of understanding the psychology of the buy. When I was at a company that operated a consumer marketplace and then also a B2B marketplace, we had to do qualitative and quantitative research to inform how we were going to turn the business around, because the business was a mature business, 40 years old. It was starting to move into contraction due to competitive headwinds, and we had to find a new way of looking at our customers. And one of the things we were selling to a lot of marketers, we were selling marketing solutions to marketers.
mhm,
And one of the things that we uncovered in our research was that these particular buyers and decision makers did not have a functional background in marketing. They were never schooled in marketing. They came up through operations and found themselves all of a sudden responsible for marketing decisions. The other thing that we realized pretty quickly was that these same decision makers were extremely egocentric in how they made purchases. It was less about the product and what the product did and even how competitive it was in the market. And it was much more about how they were going to be perceived for buying said product. So, what does that mean? It means that the way that you go and talk to these people is all about what you can do for their ego inside the organization,
mm,
right? Becomes all about helping them promote themselves because we know that that's what they care about. And it becomes less about how it's helping their on-site teams because that's less of what they care about, right? And so how we messaged that was incredibly important. That was how we grew growth from 2 to 30 million in 2 years. We couldn't have
mm.
done that if we didn't know exactly how to message to each member of the buying committee.
Wow.
You only
Wow.
get that through that psychology
Yeah,
research.
that's so powerful. And if they hadn't done that research, if you hadn't done that research, you would have missed that massive opportunity. So, in a lot of B2B markets today, there's kind of a trend toward product-led growth. And I'm sure that's much more nuanced, but at a high level, it means just make the product great. And of course, people are going to buy it, right? So you really focus on, that product market fit piece
Yep.
of it, but you don't do necessarily some of the research or nuances, or you don't even believe that people are going to be buying for reasons other than it's the greatest product, right? So
Yep.
what do you say to those people that are really moving forward? And this happens a lot in tech and a lot in software, and in a mode of product-led growth instead of focusing on psychographic factors, other buyer needs beside the
Yep.
features and functions of the product.
So I'd love to see more companies moving into customer-led growth because I think that that's fundamentally where we need to go as marketers and as go-to-market executives
Mhm.
is really think about how are we facilitating the end-to-end customer life cycle and what does that experience look like, right? And so I think when you're really focused on product-led growth, you tend to be all about acquisition at any cost because your viewpoint is that you can convert them to a paid customer at this rate or upsell them into X, right? And like, so there's this idea that the product will speak for itself. Unfortunately, because so few companies are investing in research, they're not then translating that into UX design, for example. Even UX is incredibly important and should have research behind it because how you design your software, for example, and how somebody engages in it and how easy it is to adopt is important. So, understanding how your customers are viewing the world, what matters to them, those are the things that matter the most. But what I would challenge B2B leaders to really think about is how emotional B2B buying decisions really are. There's this perception that B2B buyers are making rational, logical buying decisions when they are not. Every single consumer, whether they are buying a consumer product or a business product, is making an emotional purchase decision to some degree. The question is to what degree, right? And when you think about the role of a B2B buy, especially on a decision maker, especially in today's market where there's so much turnover at the executive level, it is risky to make the wrong choice. This is why I see so much risk aversion in IT today. It's a huge disappointment to me because I always thought IT would be one of the areas of the business that would embrace risk and changes in technology the most. I've found it to be the one that is the most resistant. And part of that resistance comes with risk. They don't want to make a decision that hasn't been supported by analysts or market research or something to say, this is why I made this decision and I shouldn't get fired for making said decision. These are things that we have to think about, especially in enterprise SaaS solutions, right? But so few companies are thinking about it in that context. The risk is incredibly high, which makes the emotion incredibly high. So understanding what is driving that emotion is more important than just having a product that that you can use to acquire new users and then market to those users. It's so much more efficient if you understand your buyer first and then design everything around that.
So let's say you do that, you follow your advice, you're a B2B company, but you invest in the qualitative research, the quantitative research, you develop these insights. Now what? So how do you kind of leverage that for competitive advantage, for market penetration? So what's the process look like from there? I know that my buyer's risk averse. I know that my buyer is emotionally driven based on these factors. What do you do then? How do you kind of make that turn that into campaigns or strategies or whatever in order to grow the business?
Absolutely. So the first thing I would do if it's a startup, for example, I would look at, okay, here are ICPs. Let's start to break out what the total market size is, how much revenue opportunity there is. Is it a one-time sale? Is it an ARR? You have to look at what your unit economics are because when you start to put together pricing and you base it on the variables that your customers are going to be using to build a business case, you can understand how different packages need to be organized for each individual type of buyer, right? So for example, I worked for a company that was selling a supply chain solution. And the supply chain solution was in oil and gas. Now, if you looked at all of our ICPs, you'd see that one of the markets that we had that was massive was offices, because
Mhm.
there are millions of them, even just in the US. However, the price point for those businesses was significantly lower. Whereas another market, hospitals, much fewer facilities, much higher price point that we can charge because of what we are actually accomplishing for them with the product, right? So building out those business cases and the unit economics that you're using to price your product is so important. Then, in addition to that, you need to be thinking about your creative strategy. So, this is where you're going to take all of those different insights, pricing, packaging, how you're going to position things. And this is where you start to put it into a formal brief. And I always use a one-page brief, and I've always trained my teams on this one-page brief because I think too many briefs are long. People don't read them. They have unnecessary information. You force people to keep it to one page, they will only put the things that matter on that one page.
Mhm.
What are the goals? How are we measuring success? What is the call to action? What behavior are you expecting in response, right? Like all of what's the message strategy and the copy strategy? How are you positioning the personality of the brand, right? All of these things are variables, and you need to think about them not only in context of individual campaigns, but also in context of your broader brand strategy. So I always tell companies to go through that sort of creative strategy process to do it for their broader brand and their broader product portfolio, as well as for each individual campaign that they're putting into the market. And that will help them keep all of the variables for each of these different elements in their appropriate place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I love that. And it's really just such a clear path from when you get those insights to really, I love the way that you talked about bringing that back into the packaging of the product. Maybe not probably the product itself, but the packaging, the strategy around the product, maybe how you bundle services, how you think about pricing, how you think about scale, in addition to what markets you're going after. But then how you just talked about like a very clear way of structuring campaigns and designing campaigns with the insights that you've gathered from that. So
Yep.
these days it seems like because of AI and the preference of digital, the predominance of digital, so it's easier to create lots of different campaigns. So, like you could create digital advocate campaigns using maybe Google or LinkedIn or Meta. You can create, obviously, have a website. You can have email campaigns. You can buy lists. You can do social media. There's lots of things you can do. You can do trade publication. You can do display advertising. So you can do all kinds of things to get your message out. How do you decide, based on the research and what you're learning with your campaign strategy, the priority of those things? Because maybe as a small, well-funded business, you could do all of those things. It's not as expensive as it sounds, right? But if you have to prioritize, how do you think about prioritizing based on what you're learning from all the strategy and insights that you're talking about?
Absolutely. So I think first and foremost, looking at that unit economics and understanding where do you have the biggest revenue opportunities, where you would, in my opinion, prioritize, right? So let's say you have six ICPs. Once you've done the unit economics, you should have a pretty good understanding of what your biggest path or your best path to revenue is if you're a startup. Or if you're a mature business, your best path to turning the business around, acquiring new customers, changing your existing customer price point, whatever it is, right? So I think part of it is that. I also think that in the past, marketers, well, anybody in revenue has relied on a really heavy tech stack to get out their message and reach people at the right time. And it's always been a bit of a guessing game. And largely it's a guessing game because not only do marketers not do this go to market research before they put things into market, but they're also not testing their actual messaging before they deploy. They're doing retroactive testing, which I never recommend because you cannot isolate enough variables to know what actually pushed things forward or what caused a contraction in engagement, right? So when you test your creative, when you test your messaging, when you use your sort of customer advisory group that you've created for research, you can then go back to them and say, does this resonate with you? Does this align with what you're looking for, right? You can ask for feedback on creative before it even goes out, which means you potentially save thousands of dollars in channel investment before you spend it because you know it's going to work, right? The other thing too is a lot of marketers they organize their teams by channel as opposed to by customer. There are times where that makes sense. However, my view of it is that if you understand your customer really well, your ICP, then not only do you understand what's happening in their mind, but you also understand where do they spend time? How do they engage? Do they even check their email? Is email even viable? One of my past companies, our target audience, they didn't check their email. These people were so busy on the road all the time traveling that they would have hundreds, if not thousands of unread emails. So marketing to them via email was not a huge opportunity for us. We had to leverage other channels, right? And so events became a very important space for us. Just as an example, social media did as well. Our sales team was huge, and our post-sale customer success team was huge because they were engaged with customers in a way that we just marketers would never be able to do. So I think that like when you're thinking about channel investment and how are we going to start spending money to make money, organizing it around your audience and where they spend time and how they are engaging in the world, whether offline or online, will help you choose what will actually generate results.
That way you can really structure your investments properly and make sure that you're allocating scarce resources in the best way. Jen,
Exactly.
we just have a few minutes left. We've been talking a lot about startups and early stage companies. Can you help me just tell me how this translates into like maybe mid-market companies? Let's say you're a company with 30 or 50 million dollars in revenue. You've got product market fit, you've got revenue, you've got a sales team, you've got a successful product. Maybe you have 10, 15 years of experience. How do you translate, but maybe your marketing has been haphazard or an afterthought or not key to your success, and you want to grow more rapidly. How do you take what you just described around research, insights, strategy, feedback to product packaging and all that and build that into campaign strategy you talked about and put that into a mid-market company so they can scale faster? How does that work?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, let's say that you're a company with 100 million in revenue, and to your point, you're an established business. You've been in business for a minimum of 10 years. You have market presence. You have brand recognition for the most part, right? Um, if you're starting to see a contraction or even just a decline in your growth, it is now more important than ever that you are going out into the field and meeting with customers, not only existing, but prospective and lost, to understand what you're doing well and where there are gaps, right? Because every established business is still, there are gaps. Even the best businesses have gaps. They are not always going to meet 100% of the market needs. So your job is to figure out where are there gaps that are competitive that we can play in and really differentiate our solution before all of our competitors can, right? So understanding what's changing in your market. How is technology evolving? How will AI disrupt things? What will be the future needs of these markets? And then adapting the appropriate strategy to go validate what you think you know and what you aren't sure you know about these customers. It's the same process, just with a slightly different outcome.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you're not, if you were coming into that mid-market company, you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're not starting from scratch. You're figuring out where the gaps are, where the issues are, and then adapting your campaigns. But it sounds like you'd still apply that same rigorous process around research insights, but with a different, maybe a more nuanced focus on those specific needs, and then adapt the campaigns to to what they've got. So I just want to focus on one area that you talked about, which is that proactive testing and maybe the role of that in the mid market. So you've done all that insights. You've kind of thought about like the campaigns. You've got these new campaigns, but you want to go out and test and understand what could happen before you go out and spend all that money. Talk to me about that process and how that feels like in a mid market company.
Yeah, so in a mid-market company, you should ideally have some allocated resources towards research, which means that in theory, you should have a line item for quant and qual. Potentially, within that, you may break that out into say, like, let's say, for example, you have a product-led growth engine and you need to understand sort of the digital path to purchase for your customers, right? So doing like a diary research with your customers could be a really effective way to understand what they actually do when they get online, and then looking at their actual computer behavior to make sure it's aligned with what they think they're doing. Because I'll tell you, there have been times when I've done the same research and found that what consumers think they're doing, what they're actually doing, are not the same. So it's, understanding what is it that you're trying to uncover? What type of research is most appropriate? It might be a focus group, it might just be a survey, it may be UX research that you need pop-ups on your website to capture. But the point is, figure out what it is that you're trying to understand and then develop something that's specific for that. When you have a focus group, for example, for creative, I always recommend going into those types of environments, asking for feedback on product positioning, whether or not creative aligns with what they're looking for, trying to understand how far off you are from the mark is where those focus groups or even qualitative interviews one-on-one can give you a lot of insight. And I'm not suggesting that any of these things need to take you months or a year. I'm talking about a couple of weeks to just plan and prepare and research and screen what you think you know
Hmm.
against what is actually out there in the market, so that when you actually put messaging in market, you know it's going to work.
I've got to think that that kind of research would just have a very high ROI because you're going to just avoid the misses that you could have. So, as a digital agency, we often focus on testing messages. So, like we're testing messages that are in market, but it's so important, it's critical to have the right messages to test. If you're testing, you can't really test something that doesn't exist. So I think what you're saying is if you have that qualitative research, you can find out really what is the possibility, what's out there, and then you can always test the right things to figure out what's there.
Exactly. Because then when you have the overall strategy sorted and you know something's going to align with your buyers, then it really becomes more about, is this the right headline? What happens if we swap out this call to action button, right? And now you can isolate for variables, and that actually does offer value, as opposed to just putting something into a bunch of channels and then saying, oh, well, social media didn't work for us. Social media might not be the problem. It might be your message, it might be your creative, it might be your targeting. Could be any number of things if you haven't done the right research up front.
And have the insight to know what to do with the research and know what to do with the campaigns and be a smart strategic marketer like you. So this has been a great conversation, Jen. I really appreciate your insights here. If some of our listeners want to connect with you and continue the conversation or learn how they can work with you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
They can reach me at jenandersonvt@gmail.com.
Perfect. That's great. We'll pull all that link and maybe a link to your LinkedIn profile as well in the show notes. Thanks again, Jen. I really appreciate the
Yeah,
conversation.
thank
Very
you.
insightful.
Thank you for having me.